All right, the last chapter for period 3, the Constitution in the New Republic, 1787 to 1800. Thus I consent, sir, to this Constitution, because I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best. The opinions I have had of its errors I sacrifice to the public good. Benjamin Franklin, 1787. With these words, Benjamin Franklin, the oldest delegate of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, attempted to overcome the skepticism of other delegates about the document that they had created. Would the new document, the Constitution, establish a central government strong enough to hold 13 states together in union that could prosper and endure? In September 1787, when Franklin, Washington, and other delegates signed the Constitution they had drafted, the young country was in a troubled condition. This chapter will summarize the problems leading to the Constitutional Convention, the debates in various states on whether to ratify the new plan of government, and the struggles of the two presidents, Washington and Adams, to meet the domestic and international challenges of the 1790s. So obviously, this Constitution is being created in order to deal with the terrible, weak federal government that existed with the Articles of Confederation. So let's go through those problems. The United States, under the Articles 81 to 87, 4 years separated the signing of the Treaty of Paris of 83 and the meeting of the Constitutional Convention in Philly. During that time, the government operated under Articles of Confederation, which was a total which consisted of a one-house Congress, no separate executive, no separate judiciary. The country faced several major problems. So it was a one-branch system, very weak. The first issue that you want to write down in your notes are these foreign problems. Relations between the United States and the major powers of Europe were troubled from the start. States failed to adhere to the Treaty of Paris, which required them to restore the property of loyalists and repay debts to foreigners. In addition, the U.S. government under the Articles was too weak to stop Britain from maintaining military posts in the western frontier and restricting trade. The Brits just wouldn't leave. They would stay there. And we had no federal army because we could not raise a federal army. Our government was way too weak. Economic weakness, and also we owed a lot of debt. And remember, we couldn't pay it. Economic weakness and interstate quarrels. Reduced foreign trade and limited credit because states had not fully repaid war debts contributed to widespread economic depression. The inability to levy national taxes and the printing of worthless paper money by many states added to the problems. In addition, 13 states treated one another with suspicion and competed for economic advantage. They placed tariffs and other restrictions on the movement of goods across state lines. A number of states faced boundary disputes with neighbors that increased interstate rivalry and tension. So you're getting a lot of economic trade quarrels. Some states, were more willing to trade with others. There wasn't a common currency. A lot of issues. Tariffs that are put on across state lines. So we end up getting is called the Annapolis Convention to deal with some of these issues. To review what would be done about the country's visibility, to overcome critical problems, G.W., George Washington, hosted a conference at his home in Mount Vernon, Virginia. Imagine being invited to G.W.'s house. Representatives from Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania agreed that the problems were serious enough to hold further discussions at a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland, at which all states might be represented. However, only 5 states sent delegates to the Annapolis Convention. After discussing ways to improve commercial relations among states, Madison and Hamilton persuaded others that another convention would be held in Philly for the purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. So you get a meeting at Washington's house, they're all sipping on some tea, and then they're saying, hey, we should hold a convention because these are big issues. And the Annapolis Convention, only 5 states show up. So you're like, you know what? We got to make this known. So they're holding a constitution in Philadelphia, born and raised. After a number of states elected delegates to the proposed Philadelphia Convention, Congress consented to give its approval to the meeting. It called upon the 13 states to send delegates to Philadelphia for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. Only Rhode Island, not trusting the other states, refused to send delegates. So 12 of the 13 states have said, we're going to do it, with the exception of RI, Rhode Island. Of the 55 delegates who went to Philadelphia for the convention in the summer of 87, all were white, all were male, and most were college educated. As a group, they were relatively young, averaging in their early 40s, except Ben Franklin, who was as old as dirt. With few exceptions, they were far wealthier than the average American of their day. They were well acquainted with the issues of law and politics. A number of them were practicing lawyers and many had helped write their own state constitutions. So you're not getting the common man, you're not getting the woman, you're not getting the African American man, you're not getting, those were the minorities and they weren't present here. The first order of business was to elect a presiding officer and decide whether or not to communicate with the public at large. The delegates voted to conduct their meetings in secret and say nothing to the public about their discussions about their work was completed. George Washington was unanimously elected chairperson. Benjamin Franklin, the elder statesman at age 81, provided a calming and unifying influence. They worked in a fashioning specific of the Articles of the Constitution was directed by James Madison, who came to be known as the father of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, and John Dickinson. While they represented different states, these conventions shared a common goal of wanting to strengthen the young nation. The thing that you're seeing here is strengthen, stronger federal government, but at the same time not being a monarchy. Several major leaders of the American Revolution were not at the convention. John Jay, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, T. Paine were on diplomatic business abroad. Sam Adams and John Hancock were not chosen as delegates. Patrick Henry, who opposed any growth in federal power, refused to take part in the convention. So there were a lot of a lot of big figureheads that weren't there. Thomas Jefferson, of course, who loved France. He was in France on business. But of course, some people, such as Patrick Henry, who was more radical, was like, I refuse to go to this convention because it's going to lead to more government power. Key issues. So let's talk about some of these key issues. Representation and slavery. Key issues. The convention opened with the delegates disagreeing sharply on its fundamental purpose. Some wanted to simply revise the articles. Strong nationalists, such as Madison and Hamilton, wanted to draft an entirely new document. The nationalists, which quickly took control of the convention. Americans in the 1780s generally distrusted government and feared that officials would seize every opportunity to abuse their powers, even if they were popularly elected. Therefore, Madison and other delegates wanted the new constitution to be based on a system of checks and balances, so that the power of each branch would be limited by the powers of the others. So, main thing you understand here is that they want a stronger federal government, but they also need a checks and balance system where each branch of the government goes ahead and checks the other's power, right? Compared to just one branch, which has power, but in some ways that can be too much power or too little. Representation. Especially divisive was the issue whether the larger states, such as Virginia and Pennsylvania, should have proportionally more representatives in Congress than the smaller ones in New Jersey and Delaware. Madison proposed the Virginia Plan, key definition. This favored the large states. It was countered by the New Jersey Plan, which favored the small states. The issue was finally resolved by a great compromise. Roger Sherman of Connecticut proposed what was called the Connecticut Plan, or the Great Compromise. It provided for a two-house Congress. In the Senate, states would have equal representation, but in the House of Representatives, they would have represented based on population. So the New Jersey Plan was a fail because what it said was, we only want one vote per state. So if you're Virginia or Pennsylvania, you are very upset about that because you have more people, therefore you feel you should have more representation, right? At the same time, the Virginia Plan would be a fail because they felt, that the small man would not be represented. So they took a combination of both, and then that's how you get our House of Representatives and Senate today. It was created by the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Plan. Slavery. Two of the most contentious issues grew out of slavery. Should enslaved people be counted in the state populations? Of course, Virginia would want that, or states with a high amount of slaves would, because you'd get more representation. The delegates agreed to the 3/5 compromise, which counted each enslaved individual as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of determining a state's level of taxation and representation. Should the slave trade be allowed, the delegates decided to guarantee that the slaves would be imported for at least 20 years until 1808. Congress should vote to abolish the practice after the date if it wished. So, two things. They said that a slave would count as 3/5 a person. That was fair for the small states, fair for the large states. At the same time, they said the slave trade would be gone after 1808. So all of a sudden, you're going to get a rush to go ahead and import slaves. Trade. The northern states wanted the central government to regulate interstate commerce and foreign trade. The South was afraid that export taxes would be placed on its agricultural products such as tobacco and rice. The commercial compromise allowed Congress to regulate interstate commerce and foreign commerce, including tariffs on foreign imports, but it prohibited taxes on any exports. So all in all, what you're seeing here is the federal government now regulates trades. The presidency. The delegates debated over the president's term of office. Some argued the chief executive should hold office for life. The delegates limited the term as president to 4 years, but with no limit on the number of terms. So 4 years, but you can be president many times you want. They also debated the method of electing the president. Rather than having voters elect the president directly, the delegates decided to assign each state a number of electors equal to the total of the state's representatives and senators. This electoral college system was instituted because the delegates feared that too much democracy might lead to mob rule. In other words, that if you let too many people rule or vote right for the president, it's just going to be chaotic. It's going to be crazy. Finally, the delegates debated what powers to give the president. They finally decided to grant the president considerable power, including the power to veto the acts of Congress. So if Congress, remember the House of Representatives and Senate, pass something, the president has the power to say, I'm going to veto it. I don't like it. On September 17, 1787, after 17 weeks of debate, the Philadelphia Convention approved a draft of the Constitution to submit to the states for ratification, anticipating opposition to the document. The framers specified that a favorable vote of only 9 states out of 13 would be required for ratification. Each state would hold popularly elected conventions to debate and vote on the proposed Constitution. So we get Federalists and Anti-Federalists as we are voting for this new Constitution. Ratification was fiercely debated for almost a year, and from September 1787 until June 1788, supporters of the Constitution and its strong federal government were known as Federalists. Opponents were known as Anti-Federalists. Key definitions, you got to know that. Federalists were most common along the Atlantic coast. In large cities, while Anti-Federalists tend to be farmers and settlers on the western frontier, they were against the Constitution. The Federalist Papers and the Federalist Campaign for the Constitution was a series of highly persuasive essays written for the New York newspaper by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. The 85 essays later published in a book are known as the Federalist Papers, presented cogent reasons for believing in the practicality of each major provision of the Constitution. So Federalist Papers are advocating for the passing of the Constitution. The outcome. The Federalists won early victories in the state conventions in Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, the first 3 states to ratify. By promising to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, they successfully addressed the Anti-Federalists' most telling objection. With New Hampshire voting yes in June 88, the Federalists won the necessary 9 states to achieve ratification on the Constitution. Even so, larger states of Virginia and New York had not yet acted. If they failed to ratify, any chance for national unity and strength would be in dire jeopardy. So the outcome is, because the Anti-Federalists, the one thing they were not one, but the main thing they were asking for was a Bill of Rights, because they were afraid of the federal government encroaching on the rights of the small farmers and the individual. What they did was they said the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments that protects the rights of the liberties of the individual. Once that was added, it was passed. Virginia. In 1778, Virginia was by far the most populous of the original 13 states. The Anti-Federalists rallied behind 2 strong leaders, George Mason and Patrick Henry, who viewed the Constitution had a strong central government as threats to Americans' hard-won liberty. Virginia's Federalists, led by Washington, Madison, John Marshall, managed to prevail by a close vote only after promising a Bill of Rights. So once again, Bill of Rights is what passes it. Final states. News of Virginia's vote had enough to influence New York's ratifying convention, combined with Alexander Hamilton's efforts to win the day for the Constitution in that state. North Carolina in November 1789, Rhode Island 1790 reversed their earlier rejections and thus became the last 2 states to ratify the Constitution as the new supreme law of the land. So adding the Bill of Rights. So let's talk about these Bill of Rights. Did the Constitution need to list the rights of individuals? Anti-Federalists argued vehemently that it did, while Federalists argued that it was unnecessary. I, for one, would agree here with the Anti-Federalists. Arguments for a Bill of Rights. Anti-Federalists argued that Americans had fought the Revolutionary War to escape a tyrannical government in Britain. What was to stop a strong central government under the Constitution from acting similarly? Only by adding a Bill of Rights could Americans be protected, such a possibility. How do we know that this new federal government isn't going to be like the King of England? In order to do that, we need to make sure our rights are protected. That's what they're saying. Arguments against. Federalists argued that since members of Congress would be elected by the people, they did not need to be protected against themselves. Furthermore, people should assume that all rights were protected rather than create a limited list of rights that would allow unscrupulous officials to assert that unlisted rights could be violated at will. In order to win adoption of constitution ratifying conventions, the Federalists finally backed off their position, promised to add a Bill of Rights. The Constitution is first order business for a newly elected Congress. Big picture, what you're getting here in the arguments of Bill of Rights, they're saying, hey, we have representation, right? This is the complete opposite of England, where the king is it's absolute monarchy. The king feels as if that he has the will of God to rule, the divine right. Right? So there's a little bit of difference here, but in the end, they gave in. The first 10 amendments. In 1789, the first Congress elected under the Constitution acted quickly to adopt a number of amendments listing people's rights. Drafted largely by James Madison, the amendments were submitted by the states for ratification. The 10 that were adopted in 79 were known ever as the U.S. Bill, forever as the Bill of Rights. Since the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868, most of the protections had been extended to apply to abuses by state government. Below is the text of the Bill of Rights. I'm not going to go through every one of these, but you should know what these Bill of Rights are. You'll study these extensively in AP Gov. Washington's presidency. If you do have questions on this, just make sure you know. For example, the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of press. Second, right to freedom of arms. Third, no quartering. Right. Fourth, you need a warrant. Fifth, you are looking at. That's a long one. So right to due process. Right. So there's just know that these are protecting the individual. Washington presidency. Washington's presidency. Members of the first Congress under the Constitution were elected in 1788 and began their first session in March 1789 in New York City, then the nation's temporary capital. People assumed that George Washington would be the Electoral College's unanimous choice for president, and indeed he was. And we talked in class about the reasons why he was able to bring people together. He was he was not necessarily someone that was political. He knew very little about politics, but he was well liked. Organizing the federal government, Washington took the oath of office as the first U.S. president on April 30, 1789. From then on, what the Constitution and system of checks and balances actually meant in practice would be determined from day to day by the decisions of Congress. As a legislative branch, the president as the head of the executive branch, and the Supreme Court as the top federal court in the judicial branch. So what they're saying is from that day, we were able to see whether or not the checks and balances of power would take place, in which each branch, what I mentioned, actually limits the power of the other. Executive departments. As chief executive, Washington's first task was to organize new departments of the executive branch. The Constitution authorizes the president to appoint chiefs of departments, although they must be confirmed by the Senate. Washington appointed 4 heads of departments: Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State; Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of Treasury; Henry Knox, the Secretary of War; and Edmund Randolph as the Attorney General. These 4 men formed a cabinet of advisors with the President. Washington met regularly to discuss major policy issues. Today, presidents still meet with their cabinets to obtain advice. So one of the first things that the executive branch has power to do is to create the cabinet, their advisors who are going to provide them assistance in different categories, as mentioned there. However, one thing you want to make sure you understand is there is a check to that power. In fact, Congress puts a check in that power, is they need to approve those appointments. The federal court system. The only federal court mentioned in the Constitution is the Supreme Court during this time. Congress, however, was given the power to create other federal courts with lesser powers and to determine the number of justices making up the Supreme Court. One of the Congress's first laws was the Judiciary Act of 1789, which established a Supreme Court with 1 Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. The highest court was the empowered rule of the constitutionality of decisions made by the state courts. That provided for a system of 13 district courts and the 3 courts of appeals. So, very important, the Judiciary Act that establishes the Supreme Court format of it, as well as the lower courts underneath it, right? And also authorizes the power of the Supreme Court to look at the laws that are being passed and whether or not they abide and follow the Constitution, right? Which is going to be an issue later on when we talk about the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions. If you don't know what that is, you're okay. Next, we are looking at Alexander Hamilton. Remember, he is the Secretary of Treasury, so he is dealing with the finances. One of the most pressing problems faced by Congress under the Articles had been the government's financial difficulties. Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, presented to Congress a plan for setting U.S. finances on a stable foundation. Hamilton's plan included three main actions. Number one, he wanted to pay off the national debt at face value and have the federal government assume the war debts of the states. So what this means is, hey, we got to pay off that debt to Great Britain, to France, whoever we may owe money to. And for all you individual states, guess what? You no longer have that debt. The federal government is going to go ahead and take that. That's problematic because think about this. You look at Virginia that had no debt, I believe, but you're having other states that have an enormous amount of debt. It is wiped out. So Virginia now has to go ahead and take because it's a federal government, they are taking responsibility for some of those debts. Number two, protect the young nation's infants, industries, and collect adequate revenues at the same time by imposing high tariffs on imported goods. Tax imports, create a national bank for depositing government funds and printing banknotes that provide the basis for stable U.S. currency. Support for this program came chiefly from northern merchants who would gain directly from high tariffs and stabilized currency. So provide a stabilized currency, but also imported goods. Because remember, the South was getting a lot of their imported goods, most likely from Great Britain. This is going to help the North because now it will come from the North. It's going to be American goods rather than British goods with that tariff. Opponents of Hamilton's financial plan included the Anti-Federalists, who feared that the states would lose power to the extent that the federal governments gained it. Thomas Jefferson led a faction of Southern Anti-Federalists who viewed Hamilton's program as benefiting only the rich at the expense of indebted farmers. After much political wrangling and bargaining, Congress finally adopted Hamilton's plan in slightly modified form. For example, the tariffs were not as high as Hamilton wanted. So the Anti-Federalists felt that Hamilton's plan was benefiting the rich, the wealthy, and not the farmer. And Jefferson would be completely upset about this. Remember, he supports the farmer. Jefferson and his supporters agreed to Hamilton's urgent insistence that the U.S. government pay off the national debt at face value and also assume payment of war debts of the states. In return for Jefferson's support of this vital plan, Hamilton agreed to Jefferson's idea to establish the national capital in the South along the Potomac River. So Jefferson, who was an anti-federalist, he agrees with this. In exchange, give Virginia the capital. National Bank. Jefferson argued, though, that the Constitution did not give Congress the power to create a bank. Remember, anti-federalists, government too much power. They don't want that. But Hamilton took a broader view of the Constitution, arguing that the documents necessary and proper clause authorized Congress to do whatever was necessary to carry out its enumerated powers. Washington supported Hamilton on the issue and proposed bank was voted into law. Although chartered by the federal government, the Bank of the United States was privately owned. As a major shareholder of the bank, the federal government could print currency and use federal deposits to stimulate business. Let's talk about foreign affairs. Who are we going to support, Britain or France? Washington's first term as president coincided with the outbreak of revolution in France. Cataclysmic event that was to touch off a series of wars between the new French Republic and the monarchies of Europe. Washington's entire 8 years as president, as well as the 4 years of his successor, John Adams, were taken up with the question of whether to give the U.S. support to France, France's enemies, or neither side. So let's talk about the French Revolution. Americans generally supported the French people's establishment of the Republic because we were a republic. But there were also many horrified. The mob hysteria, mass executions, the rich. People were afraid that this was going to lead to the farmer class rebelling against the wealthier class. To complicate matters, the U.S.-French alliance remained in effect, although it was an alliance with the French monarchy, not with the Revolutionary Republic. Jefferson and his supporters sympathized with the revolutionary cause. They also argued that because Britain was seizing American ships bound for French ports, the United States should join France in its mission against Britain. However, what Washington does is he declares a proclamation of neutrality. Washington, however, believed that the young nation was not strong enough to engage in European war. Resisting popular clamor. In 1793, he issued a proclamation of U.S. neutrality in the conflict. Jefferson resigned from the cabinet in disagreement with Washington's policy. So remember, Washington feels, so you get this conflict between Great Britain and France. Washington says we're going to be neutral. The French are very upset about this because they helped us in our war against Great Britain, and we kind of promised them that we would help them. But So as a result, Jefferson resigns from the cabinet. Citizen Guinea, that's probably not pronounced right. Objecting to Washington's policy, Citizen Edmund Guinea, the French Minister of the United States, broke all normal rules of diplomacy by appealing directly to the American people to support the French cause. So outrageous was his conduct that even Jefferson approved of Washington's requests to the French government that they remove the offending diplomat. Recalled by his government, Genet chose to remain in the United States, where he married and became a U.S. citizen. But this is more important. You got to know the Jay Treaty. Washington sent Justice John Jay on a special mission to Britain to talk to that country of its offensive practice of searching and seizing American ships and impressing seamen into the British Navy. So remember what impressment means is when they're taking American merchants and they're making them serve in the Navy, because Great Britain is in war against France. But the treaty said nothing. After a year of negotiations, Jay brought back a treaty in which Britain agreed to evacuate its post on the western frontier. So Britain would leave its post in America. But the treaty said nothing about the British seizures of the American ships. Narrowly ratified by the Senate, the unpopular Jay Treaty angered supporters of France, but did not maintain Washington's policy of neutrality. Maintained Washington's, which kept the United States at peace. So people that supported an alliance with France were upset that we're even dealing with the devil, we're dealing with Great Britain. And also, this was a very weak treaty. I mean, all it did was just it supposedly was supposed to get British troops out of there, which it didn't. And also, Great Britain continued to impress our troops, steal our merchants, and put them into their military. So we get the Pinckney Treaty. Totally unexpected was the effect that Jay Treaty had on Spain's policy towards its territories in the Americas. Seeing that the treaty is a sign that the United States might be drawing closer to Spain's longtime foe, Britain, Spain decided to consolidate its holdings in North America. Spanish influence in the far west had been struggling by a series of Catholic missions along the west coast, but they were concerned about their colonies in the southeast. Thomas Pinckney, the U.S. Minister to Spain, negotiated a treaty in which Spain agreed to open the lower Mississippi River and the New Orleans to American trade. That right of deposit was granted to America so they could transfer cargoes in New Orleans without paying duties to the Spanish government. Spain further agreed to accept the U.S. claim that Florida's northern boundary should be at the 31st parallel, not the first time. So this is very important because it opens up the Mississippi River. So we have the port of New Orleans, right? Yeah, very important. So this gives us more access to the Ohio River Valley, better trade. Domestic concerns. In addition to coping with foreign challenges, stabilizing the nation's credit and organizing a new government, Washington faced a number of domestic problems, so problems at home. First, we're getting the American Indians. Through the final decades of the 18th century, settlers across the Alleghenies and moved into frontier steadily westward into the Ohio Valley and beyond. In an effort to resist the settlers' encroachment on our lands, a number of tribes formed the Northwest or Western Confederacy. Initially, the tribes, including the Shawnee, Delaware, Iroquois, and others under the Miami War chief Little Turtle, won a series of bloody victories. Americans in the frontier were incensed by the evidence that the British were supplying the American Indians with arms. In 1794, the U.S. Army, led by General Anthony Wayne, defeated the Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in northern Ohio. The next year, the chiefs of the defeated peoples agreed to the Treaty of Grenville, which surrendered the claims to the Ohio territory and promised to open settlement. So you want to understand just further conflict of natives, and of course, it was the British that were supplying these natives with weapons, right? You want to know, of course, the Battle of Fallen Timbers. That's in 1794 when the U.S. Army, led by General Wayne, defeated the Confederacy tribes, which gives us more land in terms of the northwestern Ohio, right? Okay, the Whiskey Rebellion. Hamilton, to make up the revenue lost because of tariffs, were lowered than he wanted. He persuaded Congress to pass excise tax because tariffs on Britain and France weren't happening. He's taxing whiskey. In western Pennsylvania, the refusal of a group of farmers to pay the federal taxes on whiskey seemed to pose a major challenge on the viability of the U.S. government under Constitution. The rebelling farmers could ill afford to pay a tax on the whiskey that they distilled, rather than pay the tax they defended their liberties by attacking revenue collectors. So you're getting, remember, a lot of the whiskey, a lot of the alcohol, you need grain that's coming from the South, the farmers. So this tax is hurting them. So what they end up doing is they end up rebelling and using violence. However, this shows the strength of our new government. Washington responded to this crisis by federalizing 15,000 state militiamen and placing them under the control of Alexander Hamilton. The show of force had its intended effect, causing the Whiskey Rebellion to collapse with almost no bloodshed. Some Americans applauded Washington's action, contrasting it with previous government helplessness to do anything about Shays' rebellion. Among Westerners, however, the military action was widely resented and condemned as an unwarranted use of force against the common people. The government's chief critic, Thomas Jefferson, gained in popularity as a champion of the Western farmer. So, all in all, Alexander Hamilton, they're able to use the forces of the federal government to stop this rebellion. If you are a farmer, you are not necessarily happy with this. Western lands in 1790, the Jay Treaty and the victory of the Battle of Fallen Timbers gave the federal government control of vast tracts of land. Congress encouraged rapid settlement of these lands by passing the Land Ordinance Act of 96, which established orderly procedures for dividing and selling land at reasonable prices. The purchase for adding new states to the Union set forth the Constitution went smoothly. So we're getting some new states as we go forward. Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. So we are now getting political parties. Washington's elections by unanimous votes of the Electoral College in 1789 underscored the popular belief that political parties were not needed. The Constitution itself did not mention political parties, and the framers assumed none would arise. They were soon again proven wrong. The debates between Federalists and Anti-Federalists in 87 and 88 were the first indication that a two-party system would emerge as a core feature of the American politics. So let's look at these origins. In colonial times, there were groups of legislators commonly formed temporary factions and voted together either for or against specific policy. When an issue was settled, the factions would dissolve. The dispute between Federalists and Anti-Federalists over the ratification of the Constitution closely resembled the factional disputes of an earlier period. What was unusual about this conflict was that it was organized, at least by the Federalists, across state lines, in the sense prefigured the national parties that emerged soon after. So even before this, people would kind of group together and say, hey, you vote for so-and-so, I'll vote for so-and-so, and then it was done. But as we're seeing here, you're getting the Federalists that were created, that they would say, hey, we're going to support this Constitution. They're going to go across state lines. And then usually when you vote for something, you go back to your normal lives, but it didn't happen. These factions would kind of stay and exist. In 1790, sometimes called the Federalist era, as it was dominated by Federalist policies. Political parties began to form around two leading figures, Hamilton and Jefferson. The Federalist Party supported Hamilton and his financial program. An opposition party known as the Democratic Republicans supported Jefferson and tried to elect candidates in different states who opposed Hamilton's program. The French Revolution further solidified the formation of national political parties. Americans divided sharply over whether to support France. A large number of them followed Jefferson's lead in openly challenging President Washington's neutrality policy. So we are getting the Democratic Republicans. They support Jefferson. They support farmers. They support France. Hamilton, on the other hand, supports the British. They support more manufacturing, right? Jefferson, more state government, more Federalists, more stronger federal government. Right. So the differences between the parties, the Federalists were the stronger in the northeastern states and advocated for the growth of federal power. The Democratic Republicans were strongest in the southern states and on the western frontier and argued for states' rights, as I just said. By 1796, the two major political parties were already taking shape and becoming better organized. In that year, Washington announced that he intended to retire private life and at the end of his second term. So major differences. You want to make sure you understand. Geographically, the Federalists were in the northeastern, the Democratic were in the south and the west. More farmers were the Democratic Republicans. Federalists were typically more manufacturers, right? States' rights, Democratic Republicans. Federal rights, federal government would be the Federalists. Washington's farewell address. Assisted by Alexander Hamilton, the retiring president wrote a farewell address for publication in newspapers in 96. In this message, he had an enormous influence because of Washington's prestige. The president spoke about policies and practices that he considered unwise. He warned Americans, number one, don't get involved in European affairs, not to make permanent allies in not to make permanent alliances in foreign affairs, not to form political parties and not to fall into sectionalism. So stay away from European affairs. Don't make alliances. Don't make political parties. And at the same time, is sectionalism is bad, meaning will lead to the Civil War. That South only favors the South, North only favors the North. For the next century, future presidents would heed as a gospel Washington's warning against permanent alliances. However, in the case of political parties, Washington was already behind the times, since political parties were well underway to becoming a vital part of the political system in America. One long-range consequence of Washington's decision to leave office after the 2 terms was that later presidents followed his example, that many presidents after would just be 2 terms and done. So the 2-term tradition would go on up until the 22nd Amendment, right, which was ratified in 1951. John Adams' presidency. Let's talk about John Adams. And let me retract that statement. So prior to 1951, you would have presidents that would, there were some that would take 2 terms, but there were also some that would take a 3rd and a 4th term, like FDR. Johnson's presidency. Even as Washington was writing his farewell address, political parties were electing to gain majorities in the 2 houses of Congress and line up the electors to the various states and elect the next president. The Vice President, John Adams, was the Federalist candidate, and he was going against TJ, Thomas Jefferson. Adams won by 3 electoral votes. Jefferson became vice president because back then, that's how it worked. The Constitution gave that the office to the candidate receiving the 2nd highest number of electoral votes. So that's what happened. So imagine if Trump was president and then Hillary was the vice president. So we get some issues here. First thing is we get the XYZ affair. Troubles abroad related to the French Revolution presented Adams, who supported the British, with the first major challenge of his presidency. Americans were angered by reports that the U.S. merchants were seized by French ships and privateers. Remember, the French and the British were going against each other, and we were neutral. So the French and the British were impressing. They were stealing American ships. Seeking a peaceful settlement, Adams sent a delegation to Paris to negotiate with the French government. Certain French ministers, known as X, Y, and Z because their names were never revealed, requested bribes as the basis for negotiations. The American delegates indignantly refused. Newspaper reports made by XYZ infuriated many Americans who now clamored for war against France. Millions in defense, but not 1 cent tribute, became the slogan for the hour. One faction of the Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton, hoped that by going to war with the United States, the United States could gain French and Spanish lands in North America. So, in short, here, John Adams he wants to stop the conflict with France because they kept impressing our soldiers. He sends some officials over there, and they demand a bribe. Luckily, the American officials, the diplomats, did not take those bribes, but this was a slap in the face to American diplomacy. Bless me. So what they ended up doing was they wanted to declare war. Hamilton wanted to declare war. President Adams, on the other hand, resisted the power of sentiment of war, recognizing that the Army and Navy were not strong enough to fight a major power. The president avoided the war and sent new ministers to Paris. However, you get what we call the Alien Sedition Acts. Anger against France strengthened the Federalists in the congressional elections of '98 to win a majority on both sides. The Federalists took advantage of their victory by enacting to restrict their political opponents, the Democratic Republicans. For example, since most immigrants voted Democratic Republican, a lot of French immigrants, right? The Federalists passed the Naturalization Act, which increased from 5 to 14 years, requiring immigrants to qualify for U.S. citizenship. So meaning that they obviously can't vote if they're not citizens. They also passed the Aliens Act, which authorized the president to deport aliens considered dangerous to detain enemy aliens in times of war. Most seriously, they passed the Sedition Act, which made it illegal for newspapers to criticize the president or Congress, and they imposed heavy fines on it. So this is getting very political here. Remember, our tensions with the French are on the rise. We are almost going to go to war with France. So Adams passes the Alien Sedition Acts. The first thing is, obviously, he did not want the immigrants to vote for Thomas Jefferson, especially the French immigrants. So he increased the longevity of how long it takes to become a citizen from 5 to 14 years. Second thing is, you can't speak negatively about the president. If you did, you're going to jail. So this made it very hard to campaign against John Adams. The Kentucky and Virginia Resolution. Democratic Republicans argue that the Alien Sedition Act violated rights guaranteed by the First Amendment, freedom of speech. However, the Supreme Court had not established the principle of judicial review, meaning that the Supreme Court would look over whether or not a law violated the Constitution. Democratic Republicans challenged the legislation of the Federalist Congress by enacting nullifying laws, which means they're just not going to follow it, of their own state legislatures. The Kentucky legislature adopted a resolution that had been written by Thomas Jefferson, the Virginia legislature written by James Madison. So these resolutions basically declared that the states had entered into a compact in forming the national government, that they agree that they will form a national government, and therefore, if any act of the federal government broke the compact, the state can nullify the federal law. So meaning this, yes, we are part of the federal government, but if the government creates a law that we don't agree with and we feel is go against our rights, we don't need to follow it. So although only Kentucky and Virginia adopted nullifying resolutions, which states are not going to follow the Alien Sedition Acts, to set forth an argument and rationale that would be widely used in the next couple of chapters of who sets the constitutionality of laws, who sets whether or not laws violate the Constitution. The immediate crisis over the Alien Sedition Act faded when the Federalists lost a majority in Congress. After the election of 1800, the new Democratic Republican majority allowed for acts to expire or repealed. In addition, the Supreme Court under John Marshall asserted its power in deciding whether or not federal law was constitutional. So later on, by the 1800s, the federal government says that the Supreme Court has the power to do this. So the election of 1800, we're almost there. During Adams' presidency, the Federalists rapidly lost popularity. People disliked the Alien Sedition Acts and complained about new taxes imposed by the Federalists to pay the cost of the war against France. Though Adams avoided war, he persuaded Congress to build up the U.S. Navy and the nation's defense, which is taxes. The election of 1800 swept the Federalists from power as well as the branches of Congress. A majority of the presidential electors cast their ballots for two people, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Both of these candidates received the same number of electoral ballots. It was necessary to hold a special election in the House of Representatives to break the tie. In December 1800, the Federalists still controlled the House. They debated and voted for days before they finally voted and gave the majority to Thomas Jefferson. Democratic Republican elected in 1800 took control of both House and the Senate with the new Congress. The passing of power is very important, right? Because the passing of power in 1801 from one political party, the Federalists to the Democratic Republicans, this shows a huge accomplishment because there was no violence. This was a rare event for the times and a major indication that the U.S. constitutional system would endure the various strains. The Federalists quietly accepted their defeat, the election of 1800, and peacefully relinquished control of the federal government to Jefferson's party, the Democratic Republicans. So this shows that we avoided a revolution, that our government system is legit, right? That we're able to transition from one party to another. So let's go through this. So I'm going to go through one of these. There's a lot here. The United States, under the Article of Constitution, it was very weak. They could not raise the foreign army. There was a large amount of foreign debt that we owed. So Britain and Spain, remember, were kind of encroaching on us, and we couldn't do anything about it. Remember, Great Britain had a lot of their forts that were still there. Economic weakness and interstate quarrels. You had different states that were that were taxing each other. So as a result of this, that was very problematic. You're looking economically, there was no common currency. Economic weakness, like I said, there was a large amount of debt, and we could not tax to pay off that debt. The Annapolis Convention, so you're getting 5 states that decide to go ahead and meet and talk about the issues of the Articles of Confederation. This is going to lead to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where we go ahead and draft a new Constitution. Delegates, a couple of delegates that you want to make sure you know, we're getting anti-federalists and federalists. The anti-federalists did not support the Constitution. Federalists did. Go back and look at who some of those people are. The key issues were, think about voting. By voting I mean representation in the legislative branch, right? You're getting the Virginia plan and also the New Jersey plan. Should voting be proportional? That's what the Virginia plan wants, because they feel that larger states should be more represented. Smaller states, no, it should be one vote for all. That's what I mean by representation. We're also getting slavery as the main issues. These are the main issues right here. Slavery issue, they went and decided they're getting the 3/5, right? That a slave was worth 3/5 of a person. That way, the smaller states were happy because they aren't being abused proportionally, right? And some of those smaller states didn't have slaves, right? At the same time, slave states didn't want let me take a step back. Slave states were happy because they felt as if they were more represented as a result of having slaves. But at the same time, free states felt like, hey, at least it's not 100% the whole person. And at this point, you're seeing just the limitation of slavery, right? The free states kind of wanted that. They didn't want slavery to expand. Trade, Congress, the federal government would regulate trade. We get the establishment of the presidency, right? That would have a 4-year term, but it would be unlimited terms. Ratification would be 2/3 vote in Congress, but at the same time, the president would have the right to veto. Checks and balances are definitely there. Federalist supports the Constitution, Anti-Federalists don't. The Federalist Papers, this is a group of essays that were written by James Madison, right, and also Alexander Hamilton that would support the passage of the Constitution. The outcome was it would be passed, and the main reason why is because of the Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights, Bill of Rights, Bill of Rights. So I'll have you go ahead and take a look at these on your own here. Virginia, at first they were kind of hesitant about it, but eventually they would once the Bill of Rights was passed, right? So arguments for the Bill of Rights, why this is needed. Arguments for the Bill of Rights is because they were afraid of the monarchy. They saw what happened in Great Britain, and they were afraid that this would happen. Arguments against it. One of the things that they were saying is, well, with Great Britain, there was no representation of the people. And here we're getting people that elect the leaders, so therefore we don't necessarily need to write all the rights on paper. First 10 amendments, those are the Bill of Rights. I would go ahead and just sum up, paraphrase what they are here. Washington's presidency. First president, 2 terms. Very important to understand. Organize the federal government, 3 branches, right? You are also getting within organizing the federal government checks and balances. Each branch limits the power of the other. Executive departments. The president has the power to appoint cabinet members, right? That's obviously going to expand as time goes on, but at the same time, understand that Congress has to appoint them, right? Hamilton's financial program. He wants to pay off all the debt right away to France and just to people that supported us during the war. He says that states' debt is the federal government's responsibility to do that, but he also wants to increase taxes on imports. He eventually taxes whiskey as well. We have a large amount of debt; it's got to be paid. He wants to establish a national bank. Foreign affairs, he tends to favor more Britain and France. French Revolution is going on. A lot of people are unhappy. I mean, we support the ideals of the French Revolution, but also some people are cautious because you're getting the peasant class, third estate, that's rising up against the wealthy, and people are afraid that that might happen in America here. So Washington declares neutrality. France and Great Britain are at war, and we say no. Like we'll be neutral. We're not going to support either. But this is very important to understand because both start impressing our soldiers and stealing our merchant ships, right? Impressing means making our soldiers serve in their military. The Jay Treaty, very important to understand, is John Jay goes to Great Britain and he says, "Hey, we want kind of a treaty here. We want a little bit of a truce. Can you get your people out of the western frontier, those forts, because we already beat you in a war? And can you stop selling weapons to Native Americans? And can you stop impressing our soldiers?" They do all of that except for impressing the soldiers, and they very slowly leave the western frontier. Picquet Treaty, it gives us access to the port of New Orleans, and this is with Spain, right? A lot of American Indians concerns here. Treaty of Grenville grants us access to the Ohio River Valley. Whiskey Rebellion, you're getting whiskey farmers, right? Grain farmers that become unhappy because Alexander Hamilton, remember, he does an import tax, but it's not as high as a tax as he wants, so he needs to raise revenue. And the way that he does this is, of course, he taxes whiskey. We get a rebellion, but this shows the power of the federal government because we're able to put down that rebellion quite easily. Political parties, Federalists, and also the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans were the anti-Federalist, right? The origins, this goes, like I just explained that. The difference between the two parties, Federalists, tended to, they supported manufacturing. They support a stronger federal government. They tended to favor better relations with Great Britain rather than France. Anti-Federalists or Democratic Republicans, a little bit of the opposite. Supported farming, states' rights, right? Just weaker federal government. All right. John Adams' presidency. Let's talk about that. Comparison of, I just went over that. I hit all this, so you could go back and XYZ affair. So or a deal, because remember the French were impressing our soldiers by making them serve in their military. We go ahead and send some of our diplomats over, and the French officials try to bribe them. As a result of this, we almost go to war with France. Luckily, we don't. But one of the things that ends up happening here is John Adams passed the Alien Sedition Acts, meaning if you talk negatively about the country, you're suspected of being a French spy, you will be jailed. You can't talk negative about John Adams. You do, you'll be in trouble. At the same time, the election of 1800 was coming up, so a concern was that we'd also have a lot of French immigrants that would obviously vote Democratic Republican because Democratic Republicans favored more better relations with France rather than Great Britain. Well, so what he does here is he goes ahead, Adams says, hey, we're going to pass the Alien Act, which increases the residency requirement for you to vote from 15 years, 5 to 15 years. So you now have to live in America for 15 years, right? So not a lot of people that were about to become citizens, people that are immigrants, are able to vote, meaning this should lead for the Federalist Party to win. Virginia, Kentucky resolutions, Virginia and Kentucky basically think that the Alien Sedition Acts are unconstitutional, and they argue that, hey, we're in a compact with the federal government, we're a part of the federal government, however, if we feel that a law violates our rights, we choose to nullify and not follow it. So they go ahead and do that. Election results, election of 1800, this is very important because it shows a peaceful revolution, meaning that we were able to transition one political party to the other. So in this case, you get Thomas Jefferson, Democratic Republican, beating the Federalist Party of John Adams, and we are able to transition peacefully rather than a violent rebellion, which some people expected. Right? That is pretty much it.